How are you, folks? How are you? Here we are back in Rediscovering Our Origins, this program in which we review this spectacular research, translated from a book that we will review in the following video podcasts, with the presence of the author, Doctor Miquel Pérez-Sánchez Pla. Doctor, how are you? How are we?
How are you? Good afternoon. How are you?
Well, we are eager to know more because we finished the last podcast, the first of them, which, by the way, up here, left margin about here, you can click on the link in which you can see, if you have not seen it yet, the first video podcast in which you explained one of the great enigmas that you solved when reconstructing the pyramid in its exact form, which is that the Egyptians were knowledgeable and also used in the monument the number pi to 7 decimal places.
Yes, indeed. This was the big surprise that led me to transform what was being a simple investigation to writing a poem into a doctoral thesis. That is to say, from there I requested José Montañola, who had been my professor and former director of the School of Architecture, how he saw the possibility of changing the doctoral thesis. He told me he loved the idea. From there, we began to collaborate. And the architect José Montañola became the director of my doctoral thesis.
And from that moment on, he said that in one of the many things we were the first to discover that they knew the number pi with up to 7 decimal places, which is a tremendous historical anomaly. But you were telling me earlier off camera that you wanted to explain about 3 other things to give you an idea of the extent to which we are talking about the Egyptians having advanced scientific knowledge, which is the next thing you were going to tell me. Yes?
Right. In fact, I came to the conclusion that the Great Pyramid was a stone encyclopedia of the knowledge of the past. Why was the question? Well, the great advantage of the architecture is that even though it comes to us smashed, because I have to remember that the Great Pyramid is missing the limestone veneer, which was a smooth layer, which gave it a special shine, maybe in white color or maybe even the purple color of the San Poriente, because they found traces of iron oxide. That could have been painting the coating of the Great Pyramid. For the Great Pyramid was transformed into a kind of stone encyclopedia, and I wondered for what reason. Precisely because of the durability of the architecture. So anyway, the fact that it was a geometrical and mathematical model that contained wisdom, that contained the knowledge of the past, was something absolutely unusual. And the fact that it was 100,000 times the number pi its surface in real square cubits led me to think that it was necessary to investigate it thoroughly. And there I began to find some things, one of which had already been hinted at by some researchers, which is that the measurements of the Great Pyramid were in proportion to the measurements of the Earth. Moreover, we now know that the Earth is not a sphere, but from what I deduced from the studies of the Great Pyramid, they already knew that. That is, it was a flattened sphere. That is, imagine a soccer ball that a child squeezes with his foot. Then what happens? That what would be the terrestrial polar radius is reduced, while the equatorial radius increases in dimension. Well, from the measurements of the Great Pyramid, we can deduce that they knew about this anomaly, that they knew that anomaly in the spherical shape of the Earth. Of course, the fact that they knew the measurement of the Earth, thing that we have taken until the 19th century, early 20th century, sorry, I say it wrong, late 18th century, early 19th century, which is when the meridian was measured. But of course, we are talking about 4,300 years ahead of us. And the question is, let's see, are these gentlemen 4,000 years ahead of us mathematically and 4,300 years ahead of us geodesically? Who were they and where did they get that knowledge? And of course, that is when an idea began to emerge that later has been confirmed throughout the research process, which is that this knowledge could be inherited knowledge. The immediate question was, well, inherited knowledge, but from whom? And then some big surprises began to emerge. The research process led me to be able to determine that the Great Pyramid was a monument commemorating an ephemeris that mythology had recorded with 4 days of mourning in the ancient Egyptian world, the death of Osiris. Of course, I asked myself, hey, let's see, if Christianity happens to commemorate the death of Jesus with 2 days of mourning, what could the death of Osiris be to commemorate it with 4 days of mourning? And the subsequent research process, and I anticipate something that I believe that it is absolutely essential of all the work that has been done, is that the Great Pyramid is the monument commemorating the millennium of a very important event in the proto-history of mankind, a great cataclysm. Later we will talk about that great cataclysm, how it is documented, because essentially, since we are dealing with human proto-history, that is before written history, it is documented in the myths of the different religions. Yes?
That's right, sir. A myth reproduced in more than 50 cultures around the globe, and that would be telling us about something that here you seem to have rediscovered as our podcast well advertises. But really, well, I also want to anticipate a number of things. Remember that this is scientific information, it is not speculative. Miquel's work is purely scientific. I say this to protect myself a little bit from any kind of slap that may fall on us from some hater that I'm sure we are going to have. But above all, remember that it is his doctorate, and that is something that is very important for me, Miquel, from the point of view that we are not talking here about pure speculation, but that the data you provide are 100% scientific.
That has been the effort made. Let's see, when I decided to present my studies to the university, I had several conversations with my thesis director, and one of the things that was very clear was that speculation had to be specified as speculation if it occurred, and that only that which could be demonstrated with absolutely reliable data was science. The great advantage of architecture, which uses mathematics and geometry, is that this data can be absolutely confirmable from the point of view of mathematics and geometry itself. And this gave me great confidence that every step I took was a firm step. Therefore, I did not contemplate in my doctoral thesis what the construction process could have been, because the construction process is always speculative, because we cannot have reliable data and absolutely confirmed by mathematics and geometry that the idea we have is the exact one.
When you refer to process, I mean the methods they use
Yes.
at the architectural, logistical, material level, all this that is so controversial to see, there is always a debate that has not yet been resolved.
Nor will it be solved.
By
Nor
the
will
way,
it be
that is
solved.
also there, that will not be resolved because it is complicated. Or if there are people who investigate it, there is a researcher who is Ben van Merkwijk, who is very interesting, who is absolutely determined to demonstrate that in ancient Egypt, especially in the first dynasties, already very ancient methods that he is able or wants to demonstrate were already being used. About those methods. But well, we will not go there because that is already speculation. What you provide is purely scientific data.
No, that's right. And that has been the great effort of the doctoral thesis. That is to say, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, we wanted to present our reconstruction to other professionals specialized in computer drawing. And the result has been exactly the same.
Well, we will also go through this as we move forward with the following podcasts, also before moving on to what would be chapter 2 of the book, because we are going to follow the order of the book, especially to go through it a little bit, not reaching the conclusion why yes, but why we reached the conclusion. Today we are going to touch a little bit on Egyptian mythology, why they did things, which is also a very important element. But before we get there, I'd like you to explain the concept of the small library.
Petra, right? Well, it's a little bit what I told you about. That is, they use the architecture to encrypt scientific data, essentially at 4 levels: geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and geodesy. But there will also be a 5th system, which is very unknown, which is, do you know that sometimes it is said that stones talk? Well, it's true. It turns out that in the Great Pyramid, the stones speak. And you may ask yourself, but how can they talk? And indeed, it is a very good question. But the answer is that they speak through the measurements of the monument.
Well, I promise that we will continue to delve into all this, but let's start from a beginning that will be useful to understand the following, because here we must go with a certain established order. Above all, to understand well what we have to understand later on. And here I would like us to somehow get into the time machine. We get into the DeLorean. I'll dress up as Marty McFly, you as Doc Brown, if that's okay. And we'll go towards ancient Egypt, especially the ancient empire, which is the focus where we have to, because to understand especially the Egyptian mythology, which is like a kind of transmitting engine of the chain of knowledge that they had. It is true that the priests lived a little from the point of view of knowledge. They lived in the houses of life, or transmitted their knowledge in the houses of life, and mythology for the common people was transmitted in a smaller way, but above all the wisdom that the architect priests treasured, we could call them of the ancient Egyptian, because it was transmitted in this way. We could talk, for example, I was talking about before about all, that the pyramid is the commemoration of the death of Osiris, and the myth of Osiris has a great importance in the whole Egyptian mythology, so that we understand well where part of the wisdom comes from, where it emanates.
Yes, let's see. If we combine the myth of Osiris with the texts of the Temple of Edfu, in which it is narrated that the wisdom of ancient Egypt comes from an island that sank in the sea. From an island that sank into the sea from a great cataclysm, and that 7 wise men rescued this wisdom, we will better understand the myth of Osiris, because it turns out that Mr. Osiris dies by drowning. That is his little brother, is the Egyptian myth of Cain and Abel. His brother Seth prepares him a precious chest that says that this chest of precious stones will be given by the one who has the exact measurements to fit inside the chest. It is seen that Osiris was taller and more robust than usual. Well, the case is that the different nobles of the court try it, and none of them manages to go ahead. On the other hand, that is, he manages to stay in the chest because they are not his measurements, and curiously, between quotation marks, Osiris's measurements are perfect. So taking advantage of the fact that he is inside the chest, he and some other rebels close the chest, close it. Close the chest, close the coffin. In fact, it becomes a coffin, and throw it into the river so that Osiris dies drowned. His wife, sometime later, the river carries him to the sea. Osiris's body ends up in Lebanon. His wife goes to retrieve Osiris's body, and it turns out that she takes him to Egypt. As Seth had not finished his work well enough, what Seth does is to kidnap the body of Osiris. He cuts it into 14 parts and throws them into the river. All are recovered by Isis or his wife, except for one part, the phallus. The phallus is eaten by a fish called Oxyrhynchus, which from that moment on is absolutely despicable for the Egyptians. So what does Isis do? The lady plucks up her courage, replaces the penis with a reed, copulates with it. I imagine it must be very painful. And from there she begets Horus, Osiris' posthumous son. Let's see, the myth has elements that really make you smile because you can't imagine how the poor lady could do it. But it has a very important symbolic content. Let's see. The question I asked myself at the time is what could be 14 parts? And the answer is that those 14 parts could be 14 generations. Let's imagine that, as explained in the Temple of Edfu, the original island of ancient Egyptian knowledge sinks into the sea. Let us also imagine that this island, as such, had to have a tower that would allow it to look as far as possible on the horizon. If there is a big tsunami-type cataclysm, look what happens with a tower. A lateral thrust, the tomb. But if it turns out that you replace the tower with a pyramid after this traumatic experience, there is no lateral thrust that can move it. There is no lateral thrust to move it. So, of course, the question I asked myself is, hey, let's see, the lost phallus, considering that the phallus is nothing more than the element of hereditary transmission from one generation to the next, wouldn't the lost phallus be a tower that from this island of origins could see as far as possible on the horizon? Because then the myth would make perfect sense. And that was the first interpretation that I made of the Osiris myth, linking it with the fact of a great cataclysm that could have taken this island to the bottom of the sea. And that great cataclysm is documented in the different mythologies under the name of deluge, with the name of deluge.
And for the Egyptians, it is like a hyper-traumatic event from the point of view of, as you also mentioned before, that the pyramid was the commemoration of the death of Osiris, but by translating the myth, we can reinterpret it in the way you were telling us. For them, as we were saying, it is a very important starting point in their own mythology. We could talk about the Serayon, for example, about that megalithic structure that seems to be much older than it looks, especially because of the way it is built, the construction methods. We can go there, and in those monoliths that are tremendous, and in 200, 600 tons, what need did they have to build there like that, in that way?
There are like that. Yes, it is still very curious that the monument that seems to be, or until now it seemed to be, the most ancient in Egypt, because it is built with megaliths, a monument that seems to be of megalithic origin, is precisely dedicated to Osiris. Moreover, it is an island, subway, and it could be a reference to this primordial island lost in the origins. So the question is, what was this monument? We will see, but we'll have to wait for the second book, because in that second book, the relationship between the Serayon and the origins of Egypt is explained, and it is explained how it is intimately related to the great cataclysm that produced the disappearance of a mother civilization of which ancient Egypt would be heir. This mother civilization, how does it manifest itself in Egypt? It manifests itself through the construction of the pyramids of Giza, because the Great Pyramid, I anticipated and I demonstrated astronomically, is the monument commemorating the millennium of the great destruction of the mother civilization.
A mother civilization that we will be discovering little by little, a mother civilization that had in some way a mythology also very concrete. Okay? I say this because I would also like you to clarify the issue of monotheism and polytheism in Egypt. There is a tremendous mess with this, because normally when one thinks of the Egyptian religion, one thinks of an endless collection of mythology, thinks of an endless collection of gods that surely emanate from the same place. But it's important to understand it, because that has a translation in the beliefs of the Egyptians and in the cultural transmission of them.
Of the same, right? Indeed, look. It turns out that in the 4th millennium, that is, at the dawn of ancient Egypt, that great destruction occurs in the middle of the 4th millennium. Towards the end of the 4th millennium, we are talking about approximately minus 3,100, so 3,100 BC. There is data of a Netzerwa, which means in Egyptian one god, and that Netzerwa seems to permeate the origins of the Egyptian religion, because what we find, polytheism does not stop being a kind of screen of trees that do not let us see the depth of the forest. Let's see. Imagine Christianity or Catholicism, if you like. We have a lot of saints in different places, but there is one God, there is only one God. Imagine that most of the Egyptian gods were nothing more than local gods, but with a particularity. some local gods, like the case of Epta, for example, in Memphis, the case of Thoth in Hermopolis Magna, or the case of Ra in Heliopolis, are creator gods. They are, in a way, the local translation. The local translation of that one god who was known as Netzerwa. Note that this is of great importance because, as we will see much later, the number 1888, which is the one that allows us to certify the reconstruction of the Great Pyramid with its multiple appearance, associated with the perimeter, the surface, and the volume of the Great Pyramid, that is the number of the one God, the unique God of the mother civilization, And that is the one that in Egypt is collected with the name of Netzerwa, which I insist means nothing else than God one. And how,
as you say, there were certain cities in the ancient empire that were important for the development of this, we could call it faith, but also a cultural transmission that they had to, as I say, transmit those religious values, but also cultural and knowledge, because probably that is the core of the matter. Perhaps the common people were more familiar with religion from a slightly more superstitious point of view, but those who had the knowledge were the priests who formed part of the
houses of life. Indeed, the houses of life were, so to speak, the Egyptian universities. What happens is that, unlike ours, they were only open to the priestly caste and members of royalty. So it is as if there was a secret knowledge transmitted that did not reach the people. And look at a very curious fact, the fact that the Egyptians married between brothers. That is to say, what I asked myself when analyzing the obscurantism of the Egyptian knowledge, that is to say, the closure of the Egyptian knowledge, so that it did not leave the temples and so that it did not leave the court, makes you think of a hidden knowledge that does not want to be transmitted. But this can have a certain parallelism with the fact that they marry between brothers, because probably the kings of Egypt were nothing more than the translation or the extension over the Egyptian territory of those 7 surviving sages, that what they did was to transmit their knowledge to ancient Egypt. So let us imagine a very small number of gods, because if they had a much higher knowledge, the natives would understand them as gods that are implanted on the territory. They cross very little or almost nothing with the autochthonous settlers and use their knowledge to transform it into power. The question is, wasn't that the origin of the Egyptian dynasty? And it is very clear to me that this is only a hypothesis that developed can give rise to a theory, but we are not talking, in this case, of scientific certainty. We are talking about a possibility.
houses. We have deviated a little bit from scientific certainty also because we need to understand the foundational context of the culture of the Egyptian religion, which has a very important weight when it comes to transmitting wisdom. It is true that all that has a translation that manifests itself in the architecture, and that would lead us to think, according to the analysis that you have made in the first book, especially in your research, that before the Great Pyramid gives the feeling that there are a series of pyramids that are part of a joint project, and that would lead us to think that the projection of the Great Pyramid, and that is very important, comes from further back. Tell me a little more about it, Mr. Miquel.
That's right. Let's see. The first pyramid in Egypt is a slit pyramid, the slit pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara, which is built by Imhotep, the first architect of which there is historical documentation. In Saqqara, a very curious fact occurs. Initially, they work with mastabas. These mastabas are stacked. There is a moment in which there are 4 stacked. Imhotep intervenes in the project, increases its dimension. It ends up being a stepped pyramid of 6 mastabas, 6 superimposed steps, which is between 60 and 62 meters high. In that pyramid, there are some very interesting themes. One of them, the enclosure that developed it, the study of which I develop in book 2, is spectacular, especially from the metric point of view. Let's see. Curiously, until now, the archaeologists who had measured it had given 1,645 meters of perimeter, which is absolutely correct, but it so happens that 1,645 meters are exactly 3,141.6 real cubits, that is 1,000 times the number pi. Real cubits, that is 1,000 times the number pi. We have the number pi again, but it is also that this measurement also coincides with great accuracy. Also coincides with great accuracy with 8.88 stadiums. And the question is, what is a stadium? A stadium is 1/10 of a minute of arc of the average perimeter of the Earth. Therefore, in turn, a plethrum, which is 1/6 of a stadium, is 1/2 of arc of the Earth's average perimeter, is 1/2 of arc of the average perimeter of the Earth. Therefore, the lords of ancient Egypt were using through the number 888 a geodetic unit of measurement, which is only understandable if they knew perfectly what was the measure of the Earth. Notice that we have found in Saqqara an essential double nexus, and through the number pi, the number 888 with the Great Pyramid of Cheops. Therefore, the antecedent of the one to the other is very clear. Well, a last reflection on what you are asking. From the step pyramid arise, that is, after Djoser. After Djoser comes another pharaoh called Huni, and then comes Snefru, the father of Cheops. Those are the three most important of the time. And it turns out that Snefru does something absolutely exceptional. He builds 3 pyramids. But let's see, hadn't we agreed that the pyramids were tombs? The question is, was he going to make his body in pieces to put one in each pyramid? Or is it that none of the previous ones seemed comfortable enough for him to spend eternity? And the answer can only be one. These gentlemen were rehearsing to build a perfect pyramid, which Pharaoh Snefru achieves with the 3rd pyramid he builds, which is the Red Pyramid of Djoser, the first perfect pyramid. And from there, with respect to the first pyramid he built, which is also a step pyramid, which is the Meidum Pyramid, he covers it, and covers it practically with the same inclination of the Great Pyramid. Therefore, the answer can only be one. That is, they were rehearsing to build the perfect pyramid. And why was Snefru in such a hurry to make 3 pyramids? For a very simple reason, because he had an appointment with history, and the appointment with history was to commemorate with a perfect pyramid, which would be the Pyramid of Cheops, which his son was building, an appointment with history, the millennium of the destruction of the mother civilization.
Let's stop for today, because this is a lot of information and it is also very important. Remember, I did not tell you in the first one. You can leave your comments, or rather you can write us at info@antiguaegipto21.com. There we will listen to everything you want to comment, move, and so on. Remember to subscribe to our channel. Also remember that you can follow us on our social networks. All this is in the description of the video and nothing else. Say a hug to all of you, and we hope to see you in the next one. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Until next time.